All right, it's about that time. Welcome to this session entitled Remembering Joseph Smith's Presidential Campaign. We're glad you're with us for this. We've got two fantastic papers and presenters. Our second presenter today is Spencer W. McBride. He's the Associate Managing Historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project and a Managing Historian in the Church History Department. He earned his PhD in history at Louisiana State University. McBride is the author of multiple books on religion and American political culture, including Pulpit and Nation, Clergymen and the Politics of Revolutionary America by University of Virginia Press, and Joseph Smith for President, The Prophet, the Assassins, and the Fight for American Religious Freedom through Oxford University Press, and that's just recently. And he has written about the evolving role of religion and politics for the Washington Post and the Deseret News. McBride is the creator, writer, and host of 3 docu-series. You may have listened to those. Fantastic job. From the Joseph Smith Papers on the First Vision, the Priesthood Restored, and the Nauvoo Temple. He was born and raised in California, and McBride now lives in Utah with his wife, Lindsay, and their 4 children.
Good afternoon. My name's Spencer. I wrote a book about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. For those who may not have read it yet, I won't tell you how it ends. But in writing a book, and in talking about this book, I'm often inclined to invoke the great writer Charles Dickens, and that might seem odd to you. But I promise if you bear with me, it's all going to come together. You see, Charles Dickens wrote what I personally think is the greatest opening line to any novel ever. Now, some of you might be thinking about A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I mean, that's good too. But my personal favorite line, and one that drives my organization of the work I present as a historian, is this. It comes from A Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens writes, "Marley was dead to begin with." It's amazing, right? You're sucked in with that one line. And then he goes on for 3 paragraphs to tell you just how dead Jacob Marley was. And I'll tell you, he was as dead as a doornail. Why so long on Jacob Marley's death? Well, what Dickens writes next is that Marley's death, his status of being deceased, must, quote, be distinctly understood if anything wonderful is going to come from what I'm about to relate. As a historian, I love a good story, but I also want to make sure those to whom I speak and to whom I write understand kind of the bigger point. What must be distinctly understood if anything wonderful is to come from my remarks today? And it's this. Prior to the American Civil War and the adoption of the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights did not apply to individual states. I'll say that again, because it's really important. And we heard about that from Dr. Gordon this morning. Prior to the American Civil War and the adoption of the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. And it wasn't even until the 1920s that the Supreme Court begins to consistently apply the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment to the individual states. This must be distinctly understood if we're ever going to make sense of why Joseph Smith ran for president and why people today should care about a presidential campaign that ultimately had no chance of succeeding. See, I wrote this book knowing that Latter-day Saints and those that come from denominations who trace their heritage back to Joseph Smith would have a natural curiosity about this campaign. I wanted to help them understand it. But I wanted to tell the story in a way that those who might not care about Joseph Smith at all can find meaning and significance in his quixotic presidential ambitions. Joseph Smith ran for president to change the Constitution on this point. He believed that religious minorities would never experience full religious freedom until the federal government was empowered to protect them when states failed to do so. And we can see how he arrived at this point. The expulsion from Jackson County, a petition to Andrew Jackson's administration led to no federal redress. The expulsion from the state of Missouri under threat of state-sanctioned extermination, a meeting with the president in the White House, a Senate committee hearing in the Capitol building, and the federal government said, we can do nothing for you. Can you see why Joseph Smith saw a problem with the reigning constitutional interpretation of the day? And it wasn't just a popular reading of the Constitution. There was precedence. In the year, I wrote this year down because I always seem to forget it. The year 1833, the Supreme Court decided in the case of Barron v. Baltimore, explicitly, the Bill of Rights cannot be enforced on the individual states by the federal government. And then a year after Joseph Smith would die, just to show you the context in which he was living, the Supreme Court would rule in another case, Permoli v. New Orleans, that specifically the federal government cannot enforce the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment. Joseph Smith said, something has to change if we're ever to experience universal religious freedom in the United States. But his answer wasn't to run for president, not initially. He continued to petition Congress. As Derek said, in 1839, 1840, he meets with Van Buren. They have a Senate committee hearing. And they're told the federal government has no jurisdiction in the case. But that doesn't stop Joseph Smith. In the fall of 1840, they petition Congress again. No luck. In 1843, again, no luck. And in 1844, again, no luck. It's when, in 1843, that it appears that what had happened in Missouri is about to happen again in Illinois, that Joseph Smith and church leaders get desperate. How can we protect the civil rights of our people living as American citizens? Joseph Smith writes, as Derek mentioned, to all 5 men expected to run for president: Martin Van Buren, Richard Mentor Johnson, Lewis Cass, John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay. Only 3 of the 5 respond. Clay and Calhoun give responses that really irked Joseph Smith, but they at least had a principle upon which they were standing. They cited states' rights. They said, according to the doctrine of states' rights, this is paraphrasing them, the federal government can and should do nothing to help you. Now, Joseph Smith didn't like those answers, and this is just my personal opinion, though. If there was one that irked him more than any others, it was that from Henry Clay. Because Henry Clay gave like the most politician answer ever. I sympathize with you, I feel for you, but I don't want to make any promises because then I'm going to be held accountable for them when I'm elected. No one agreed to help the Latter-day Saints. And it was in this setting, this sense of desperation, that Joseph Smith and his fellow church leaders decided they should have an independent candidate for president. And church leaders, namely the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, determined it should be Joseph Smith. Now, one issue drove Joseph Smith into the election, but he was not a one-issue candidate. He published a robust campaign platform called General Smith's Views on the power and policy of the government of the United States. They weren't really into short titles. And he called for the end of slavery by purchasing the freedom of the enslaved men and women from the proceeds of Western lands sold by the federal government. He called for criminal justice reform, that the rising, burgeoning penitentiary system was designed to punish but not rehabilitate, that in essence, there was class discrepancy in how people were punished by the legal system, and that prisons were designed, in essence, to create a permanent criminal class. He argued for territorial expansion, annexing Texas, taking all of the Oregon country, and eventually, if the people in these lands allowed it, expanding into Canada and Mexico. He called for banking reform. But at the heart of his campaign was this: that the federal government should be empowered to protect religious minorities when states refused to do so. Well, we know how the story goes. He runs a campaign, he sends out hundreds of electioneering missionaries, and Derek has written the most in-depth study of the men and the women who serve those missions that exist. And they canvass the country. Some newspapers mock Joseph Smith. Others dismiss him entirely. Others take seriously certain planks in his platform, but are unwilling to take him seriously as a candidate. But it is all for naught because Joseph Smith ultimately is assassinated. And I know I told you I wouldn't tell you how it ended. I'm sorry, I forgot. But this is important because it illuminates a forgotten aspect of American history. We love to talk about the United States as a place of exceptional religious liberty. And on a global stage, you know what? We do pretty well. The United States is doing a lot better than a whole lot of other countries, even early in our history. But we are fooling ourselves if we buy into the myth that religious freedom was in place from the time of the founding on, because it simply wasn't. But when we have these oversimplistic views of the American past, we create what one historian has called myths we forget by. And so in talking about the unpleasantness, the unpleasant episodes of American history, including the story of Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints, it's not to demean the American founding or to demean the American experience, but to understand it and to get better. And that's what Joseph Smith's story can do. And it doesn't just tell us that there were mobs and that there were bigots and that there was prejudice. We know that. It tells us that there were structural problems that emboldened mobs to persecute religious minorities. It wasn't simply prejudice in the minds of some Americans. It was constitutional interpretations and laws on the books that condoned such prejudice. That's where Joseph Smith's story, I think, is really relevant to the larger narratives of American religious freedom. But it also helps us understand many of Joseph Smith's actions in the last year and a half of his life. Actions that have led some of his biographers to deem him a megalomaniac when I don't think that's actually the truth. Let me give you a few examples. Joseph Smith, while he's running for president, has church leaders petition Congress to make him a general in the United States Army. They petition Congress to make Nauvoo a federal city, comparable to Washington, D.C., in that it would essentially secede from Illinois and be under federal oversight. Simultaneously, they are petitioning Congress to donate a generous tract of land in the Western Territory to the Latter-day Saints where they could settle. And Joseph Smith has dispatched members of the Council of 50 to negotiate with the Republic of Texas about the Latter-day Saints potentially moving there, leaving the United States altogether. What do all of these actions have in common? They're trying to get around the doctrine of states' rights. If Nauvoo is a federal city, the federal government can protect the Latter-day Saints. If Joseph Smith is a general in the United States Army, he can dispatch troops to protect the Latter-day Saints. If the Latter-day Saints move to Texas, they don't have to worry about states' rights at all, so on and so forth. And so it's when we understand that Joseph Smith meant it when he said it to the Nauvoo City Council, the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. And that's a quote, not a paraphrase. He was speaking about the situation that he and his fellow Latter-day Saints were in. They were religious minorities desperate for protection. And these unprecedented actions taken in the last year and a half of Joseph Smith's life are often what religious minority groups have had to do in American history. Throw whatever legal challenge they can against the metaphorical wall and see what sticks. You know, something that was really fascinating to me as I researched for this book is to see who else was calling for the enforcement of the Bill of Rights to individual states at this time. Joseph Smith was early. He's on this Vanguard. And if you look at two of the other most prominent examples, you have the Shakers in New York. Now, the Shakers were pacifist, and they held all their property in common. In New York, there was a law that required all men to enlist in the state militia, and if you did not, you would have to pay a $4 tax. But because the Shakers held all their property in common, they argued that that amounted to a tax on their religious community because of their doctrinal belief in pacifism. They argued that where New York was persecuting them, the federal government should be able to protect them. They failed in those requests. Similarly, in 1845, you have a Catholic priest in New Orleans, Father Bernard Promoli, who is being prevented from holding open casket funerals due to a pandemic in the area that summer. He sees this as an infringement on his religious freedom. His case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. He fails. But if we look at who is on the vanguard of Americans calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to individual states, it's not constitutional scholars. It's not legal experts. It's leaders of religious minority groups whose lived experience has led them to realize there's something wrong with the Constitution when this can happen to us. They are the first, or among the first, to call for this constitutional reform. So, in conclusion, let me ask this question. Was Joseph Smith right when he said that the states' rights doctrines were what feed mobs? In part, yes, but it wasn't the entirety of the problem, because as Derek told us, once the Latter-day Saints moved to Utah territory, things don't get better. In fact, in some ways, they get worse. They were beyond the states' rights doctrine, but under complete federal oversight, their problems did not go away. However, there's one incident that I think speaks to the viability of Joseph Smith's claim, and this happens in 1854 in the state of Missouri. Senator David Atchison, a sitting U.S. senator, and some of you might know that name more because he was a member of the militia who helped expel the Mormons from Missouri in the first place, now a sitting senator, writes to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, about a new, quote-unquote, unwanted political minority in the state of Missouri. It's not a religious group. It's the abolitionists. They're flooding into Missouri, a slave state, and the enslavers who live in Missouri are worried about it. And David Atchison writes to Jefferson Davis, assuring him that he's got it covered. And this is what he writes, quote, "We are organizing to meet their organization. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionist." A sitting United States senator had turned the word Mormon into a verb that meant to shoot, burn, and hang an unwanted political minority. It's appalling, but how did he get to that point? This is how Missouri had treated the Latter-day Saints as an unwanted political minority, and they had gotten away with it because of states' rights. They were emboldened then in 1854 to do the same thing. In this instance, states' rights really did feed mobs. And so I mentioned this in my book and in my presentation because I think as we talk about religious freedom in the present, and we can see that the United States has done well, but we're not there yet to the goal. There's more work still to do. Yes, the fight for religious freedom is a fight against prejudice. It's a fight against bigotry. It's a fight against violence. But it's more than that. It requires each and every one of us to consider political philosophies that on the surface may have nothing to do with religion or religious minorities. Such was the case with the states' rights philosophy. But some of these political philosophies that on their surface are benign, in their implementation have a discriminatory effect on minority groups. Joseph Smith's call for constitutional reform then echoes today as a call for us to be mindful and considerate of how some policies that we support may or may not have similarly discriminatory effects. Thank you.
Well, that was fun, wasn't it? That exceeded my expectations. All right, we have the opportunity now to ask some questions.
Just a quick question based on the information you talked about on states' rights. Would that justify the Confederacy to, did it still go on until the Civil War broke out, the Confederacy to repulse the Union Army for coming down on the same basis and attack them?
So make sure I understand your question, that the states' rights philosophy could be used to justify.
The Confederacy in their war.
So the Confederacy used states' rights as justification to protect slavery and then to secede from the Union. Whereas I see Joseph Smith as being opposed to the states' rights philosophy. Not necessarily because he had a distinct view on federalism in theory, but in practice, he realized one of the main problems was religious minorities could not get protection. So yeah, I don't think Joseph Smith was using and thinking about states' rights the same way that the Confederacy would. In fact, probably quite the opposite. And he himself had called for the end of slavery. And just as an aside, it's fascinating because I don't know if his plan would have worked to end slavery in a country where it was so entrenched and people were so committed to this institution. But it was Josiah Quincy, the mayor of Boston, who in the year before he died in the 1880s, I believe, remembered meeting Joseph Smith and lamented that the country hadn't considered more plans like Joseph Smith's, more creative ways of ending slavery before it took a civil war to end it. And so that's just an aside, only tangentially related to your question. I hope it's worth it, though.
Okay, so Spencer, why don't you repeat the question? Yeah.
So do I see any similarities to what Joseph Smith was saying in his campaign to ongoing controversies with election laws? I don't. Elections ran similarly, but in some ways a little differently then. There was the Electoral College. There was voting in the community, but each community kind of had a lot of leeway in how they.
I meant today's present election.
Oh, today's present election laws. Yeah, and I don't know if Joseph Smith had much to say on election laws. I mean, he was a fan of democracy and free and fair elections, I think is fair to say. Because I've been speaking about this book a lot, it's natural for questions of people wanting to compare Joseph Smith's political views then and try to say, hey, where would he fit today? I think it's entirely natural that we wonder that. And the best answer I can give is more kind of high level, because I don't know if Joseph Smith fits in any one party or in any one camp today on the many issues such as election laws. But I think if we're trying to find present-day parallels to Joseph Smith's platform, the core of Joseph Smith's political platform was compassion for those on the margins of society. He's calling for the protection of people who are imprisoned, sometimes imprisoned more harshly because of their class status. He's calling for the protection of religious minorities. He's calling for the protection of racial minorities. And so the common theme in Joseph Smith's political platform is compassion for those on the margins. Where that would bring him on matters of election law, I'll ultimately let each one of you guys ponder for yourself. So I hope that's a satisfactory non-answer.
Other hands, yes, please.
Yeah, so the question was an observation, I believe, from Alex Baugh's paper about the Missouri, am I right on that? The Missouri Constitution actually lists freedom of religion. And this was common in many of the state constitutions, and it wasn't enforced. And that is part of it. So there is an element of lawlessness. And one of the things we have to understand about religious freedom in this time is it was by Protestants for Protestants. And how do you justify treating Latter-day Saints the way you treat them? You justify them as fanatic. You call them fanatics. You describe their religion as not really religion in order to justify this treatment. And then all of a sudden, you're not persecuting, in the minds of these vigilantes, you're not persecuting a religious minority. You're defending democracy, is how they justify it in their minds. Joseph Smith was not trying to get rid of state sovereignty, states' ability to make laws to be enforced in their states. What he was saying is there's a problem when the state itself is the offender, is the one abridging the rights of a religious minority. What do you do, in his words, when the governor himself is a mobber? What do you do when the state is not doing its responsibility or is the one offending? And that's where the constitutional change had to come in. And so that, I guess that's why the emphasis should be empowering the federal government to protect religious minorities when states fail to do so. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but so if the Supreme Court and the federal government are the ultimate protectors, if they are just as corrupt as the governor of the state of Missouri was, what have we gained?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the problem. So Joseph Smith is trying to essentially bring about an ideological change in the way we talk about the Constitution, but also to change the hearts and minds of the people and saying, look at what has happened to the Latter-day Saints. It's an uphill battle. And ultimately, the Latter-day Saints, as Derek mentioned, choose to leave the United States because they feel the country has failed them time and time again. They're not going to the Utah Territory when they leave. They're going to Mexico. Derek?
All right. Let's go ahead and end there. We want to, just for a minute, thank our panelists one more time, please.